Have you ever met someone who looks calm, but carries a storm inside? Someone who doesn't beg for attention, doesn't explain themselves too much, and somehow learned how to survive disappointment without making noise. That's Gen X. They are the generation people rarely talk about. Not as loud as the boomers. Not as emotional online as millennials. Not as hyper-expressive as Gen Z. But psychologically, Gen X may be one of the hardest, most emotionally guarded, and most quietly damaged generations alive. They grew up in a world that didn't ask how they felt. It only asked whether they could handle it. And they did. But the way they survived, it changed them forever. Gen X are people roughly born between 1965 and 1980. They are the generation that grew up between two worlds. Too young to be traditional like the boomers. Too old to grow up with the emotional language and internet culture of millennials and Gen Z. They were raised in an era of rising divorce rates, emotionally unavailable parenting, figure it out yourself, family systems, less supervision, more independence, and a lot of silent emotional neglect. Many Gen X kids came home from school to an empty house. No one asking, "How was your day?" No one checking in deeply. No one teaching emotional intelligence. They were the original latchkey generation. And when a child learns early that comfort is not guaranteed, they stop expecting it. That is where the rough psychology begins. People praise Gen X for being independent. And yes, they are. They can solve problems, handle pressure, adapt fast, keep moving when life gets ugly. But that independence was not always healthy. For many of them, independence wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival mechanism. They learned. Don't rely on people too much. Don't expect emotional rescue. Don't make your pain everyone's business. Fix it yourself. Endure quietly. So now, as adults, many Gen X people look strong on the outside. But internally, they often struggle with emotional suppression, trust issues, difficulty asking for help, chronic self-reliance, discomfort with vulnerability. They can love deeply, but still keep part of themselves locked away. Because when you grow up learning that weakness gets ignored, you become addicted to appearing strong. This is one of the most dangerous things about Gen X psychology. They often don't describe painful experiences as trauma. They describe it as, "That's just how life was. We all went through it. It made me stronger." You kids are too soft. And while sometimes that toughness did create resilience, it also created a generation that often mistook emotional numbness for strength. They survived things they never fully processed. Harsh parenting, abandonment, instability, financial pressure, betrayal, emotional neglect, being forced to grow up too fast. But instead of unpacking it, they carried it silently. This is why many Gen X adults can seem emotionally solid, yet strangely disconnected from their own deeper wounds. Not because they don't feel pain, but because they were trained to function through pain. That's a very different psychology. One thing Gen X tends to value heavily is loyalty. Why? Because many of them grew up watching promises break. They saw marriages collapse, institutions fail, leaders lie, parents check out emotionally, society shift in unstable ways. So trust did not come easily. They became skeptical. Not loud skeptics. Not dramatic skeptics. Just observant. They watch people carefully. They notice patterns. They often don't say much at first, but they are reading everything. That's why many Gen X people don't open up quickly, hate fake people, pull away instead of arguing, value consistency over sweet words, would rather see proof than hear promises. If you betray them once, they may never fully return. Because psychologically, they already grew up learning that disappointment is normal. So when it happens again in adulthood, they don't always explode. They detach. If you've ever noticed Gen X humor, it can be dry, sarcastic, dark, brutally honest. That's not random. Dark humor is often a defense mechanism. It helps people survive what they don't know how to emotionally explain. When pain becomes familiar, humor becomes armor. Gen X learned to laugh through family dysfunction, economic uncertainty, emotional neglect, social chaos, unmet needs. They mastered the art of acting like things were fine, while privately carrying weight most people never saw. That's why their humor often sounds like, "It is what it is. Welcome to life. Nobody's coming to save you. You live." It sounds cold. But beneath that roughness is often a person who learned early that if they didn't toughen up, life would crush them. A lot of Gen X people are loving. Very loving. They provide. They protect. They stay loyal. They show up when it matters. But many of them struggle with one thing: emotional softness. Not because they don't care, but because they were not always taught how to safely express care. So they may say, "I'm here, aren't I?" instead of, "I need you." They may give money, fix problems, or offer solutions, instead of sitting in emotional conversation. They may love through responsibility, not through emotional language. This can make them seem distant, stubborn, or hard to read. But often, what looks like emotional coldness is really emotional protection. They were built in a time when feelings were often treated like weakness. So even when they love you deeply, they may still struggle to let you fully inside. A lot of younger people see Gen X and think, "Why are they so tough? Why do they act like emotions are a burden? Why do they call everything soft? Why do they struggle to validate feelings?" Here's the uncomfortable truth. Because they were raised in environments where their own feelings were rarely validated. And people often pass down what they were forced to survive. If no one slowed down for your pain, you may unconsciously struggle to slow down for someone else's. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. Gen X often sees younger generations expressing anxiety, burnout, boundaries, or emotional needs. And part of them reacts with resistance. Not always because they are heartless. Sometimes because it triggers something painful. Where was this compassion when I needed it? That unspoken resentment can make them seem rough. Because beneath their criticism, there is often grief. Grief for the softness they never got. Now here's what makes Gen X powerful. For all their rough edges, they are incredibly durable. They are often mentally resilient, adaptable under pressure, hard to manipulate, realistic about life, capable of surviving isolation, emotionally disciplined, deeply loyal once trust is earned. They may not always speak in therapeutic language. They may not post every feeling online. They may not always ask for help. But when things fall apart, they often know how to stay standing. They are the kind of people who can lose everything and still find a way to rebuild without making a scene. That kind of psychology is not glamorous, but it is powerful. The truth is, Gen X is not just hard. They are often hurt in a way that became functional. That's what makes them so misunderstood. They are not always emotionally unavailable because they don't care. Sometimes they are emotionally controlled because they had no safe place to fall apart. They are not always cynical because they hate people. Sometimes they are skeptical because life taught them not to trust too easily. They are not always distant because they don't love. Sometimes they love so deeply. They fear what happens when they lose what they let in. Gen X is the generation that learned how to keep going without applause, how to survive without comfort, How to function without closure. How to carry pain without language. And that creates a very specific kind of person. Strong. Guarded. Loyal. Dry. Observant. Resilient. And often, emotionally scarred in silence. So the next time you meet a Gen X person who seems tough, sarcastic, emotionally reserved, or impossible to read, look deeper. Sometimes the hardest people are not the ones who feel the least. They are the ones who learned the earliest that nobody was coming to soften life for them. And that kind of childhood creates adults who survive almost anything, but often at the cost of tenderness. Do you think Gen X is the strongest generation, or the most emotionally wounded one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Follow for more deep psychology content.